Oh, guys, good, you hear? I am so excited. Guess what? I hope this isn't about your podcast again. Why, did you finally listen to it?
Da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da. The Gloomy Next Door production.
The 1970s and 80s had Elbow, Gravy Train, Purina, Meow Mix, and Bell Bottoms. You've changed your clothes, now change how you feed your pet. Like Bell Bottoms, kick the kibble and join us in the 21st century with the healthiest diet for dogs and cats. Feed naturally, feed raw, feed fishing foods. The 1970s and 80s had Elbow, Gravy Train, Purina, Meow Mix, and Bell Bottoms. You've changed your clothes, now change how you feed your pet. Like Bell Bottoms, kick the kibble and join us in the 21st century with the healthiest diet for dogs and cats. Feed naturally, feed raw, feed fishing foods.
Hello, pups and kittens, and welcome to another fun-filled and informative episode of the Groomer Next Door podcast. I'm your host, Chris Green, and joining us for this conclusion episode of Plant-Based Diet is our good friend, Daniel Orrega. I am so privileged and honored that he was able to, find some time to be on and give us his insight when it came to plant-based. Before we actually get into it, I wanted to address a couple things when it came to plant-based because this is the conclusion episode. So, I've definitely come to a very decisive decision on plant-based, and that is, I really do think that we have a foundation. And I think that there is a definite alternative and opportunity here. I don't know what sustainability is on this topic, so I can't say whether or not it's perfect, but I think that we're moving in the right direction. And over the course of doing this, I have come to really learn a lot. And the things that I've learned were not exactly things I was happy to find out or hear different things that I heard from people. Throughout this process, a lot of negativity came from different people who weren't even going to listen to the episode. They just wanted to have their own say when it came to it. And I'll tell you, that was very disconcerting. I really was not expecting such negativity. Not even the willingness to open up the mind a little bit to say, hey, maybe, or let's find out. It was, no, you're wrong, period. Or one that really kicked me was that they accused me of taking money for doing this series, and it was all financially backed, which was not true. I didn't. But, that really led me to realize that it was more of a anger and a jealousy factor than it was anything else. They were just mad that they thought that somebody else would make money and they wouldn't. And that really, really ticked me off. Something that happened that really set me off, that I was very upset about, and currently still am, is I would go out on social media, which the whole parameter has changed over the plant-based diet. This will be the last episode I do publish on Facebook and social media because of the negativity that's out there. But I did accidentally, and I will come clean, I accidentally posted on what I thought was a friend's page. And it wasn't intentional, it was accidental. And when I found out, I sent them a message and I apologized because it was never part of my plan. And the response was absolutely vile. I am and still disgusted by what transpired. I'm not going to say I didn't do it because I did. I posted it on there for discussion, but it wasn't intentional. It wasn't supposed to go to that page. And, again, I am sorry that I did post it there, but like I had said to the person, it wasn't like I meant to do it. And my gosh, the vile comments that were made, just unbelievable. And I really expected better. It's kind of funny. I have the luxury of being the final word when it comes to the subject because it's my show. And I'm going to take advantage of that final word, and that is, I didn't mean to do it. I know they're not listening to this episode, but I'm doing it for my own good. That, I didn't mean to do it. I apologized. They came back with more vile comments, and that really, really upset me. And like I said, still does. Because I expected better from them. So, that's kind of the gist of it. But I really hope that we continue to actually look at this as a possibility, as an alternative. Because honestly, with all the problems with big pet food, we have to think what's best for our dogs, what's best for our cats. Can a cat or dog healthy sustain on a plant base? And that's what this has always been about. It's not about, yes, this is the only way it's going to work. This is it. No. That was never my intention. My intention was to let these people, for the first time, have an opportunity to plead their case, give you the details, uninterrupted, nonetheless, and not judge it and not knock them down. It's so easy to just say, nope, not possible, you're wrong. I wasn't going to do that. And, the quote unquote cool thing to do is to say you're wrong and tell them how they're wrong. That's what's cool right now. I'm not cool. Never have been, never will be. I would rather have a conversation. I would actually like to learn from it. And I want to publicly apologize to Dr. Dodd, V. Cotto, and V-Dog. You guys face continued criticism daily, and it's not right. You can disagree with anything out there, everyone, but there's a limitation to just snarky remarks. There's a difference for attacking people. And from what I've seen, what's out there, these attacks are just unacceptable. And in a day and age where we have the unfortunate school shootings, we have the unfortunate of shootings at concerts from a hotel, where we have unbelievable murder for no good reason. Not like there is such a good thing as murder, but we have senseless murder. And then we have these people that are trolling the internet and attacking all different kinds of things that they don't understand. That upsets me. And I didn't expect to learn what I learned. I expected I would, get a little bit of information about plant-based diet and that'd be cool. But what I learned from the unfortunate experience, it was more than I wanted to ever see. I want to believe that pet parents are good people, loving people, and willing to do what's right for their dog or cat. And if there's something new that's coming up on the horizon, they're willing to actually listen or learn about it. That's all that this has ever been. Listen, ingest it, come out of every episode with your own opinion, not my opinion. Because honestly, folks, I don't want you to base whatever I say or an expert says with, do it that way. I don't want that. I want you guys to make your own decisions. Unlike a lot of shows out there that say, follow me, my helpless ones. No, I believe that all of you have a brain. I believe all of you have your right to decide. And if you think plant-based works and the science will show it to you and prove it to you, then do it. If you don't believe in it, then don't. No one's going to fault you. No one's going to say you're wrong. Because honestly, that's not what I'm allowing here. For the rest of the time I do this, it will always be the same. Anybody who comes on here, it's freedom. You have the opportunity to decide. You have the opportunity to make your own decision and say whatever you're doing. I won't object to it unless it's a couple different people that I've objected to. And you guys all know there's 2 episodes out of all of them. There's only 2 where I actually put the person on trial because what they're doing is wrong. I really do believe that we're making a great scientific discovery by thinking outside the box. And I really look forward to seeing where the progress comes and where we go. Well, by that sound, Daniel is about to enter the podcast studio. So, with that said, let's get the conclusion episode of this plant-based diet series rolling.
Oh, hello. Hold on a sec. Dad, we have a guest on the podcast.
Oh my gosh, I am so happy. This is the day that I think I have been looking forward to for a very long time. The conclusion episode of Plant-Based Diet, and I am so happy. I get to actually talk to a good friend of mine, and he is, I still say this jokingly, and I mean it seriously, he is the person that Rodney Habib and Dr. Karen Becker go to for every answer that they ever have. We are joined this week by Daniel Orega. Thank you for being on. I appreciate it.
Hey man, it's super cool to connect with you again. It's been a little stretch since we were last able to link up, so I'm glad we're talking.
You know, it's funny. We a little insight to this. We've been talking quite a lot over the last, has it been like a month, 2 months, something like that, since I started this whole thing? And you were one of only 4 or 5 people who actually heard this whole thing before it was ever released. And I couldn't think of anybody who understood the science behind this better than you. You really get it. And that's what really intrigued me about this whole spectrum. It's like, who do I have who can have that open mind, who will understand this, and then all of a sudden will be able to tell me something that I'm completely blown away by and have more knowledge than you.
Well, man, I'm excited to get into these topics because, like we were discussing a little bit off air, these are invariably intriguing and frankly a lot of fun to explore. We were talking a little bit about it's tough to speak on these topics from an absolute position of authority, but one can definitely approach them from a position of discovery and inquiry.
And, during this whole conversation, we might lose Daniel a couple times, but there is never a time that he is not stationary. He is always on the go. Over the last few weeks, I have talked to him in Texas. He's been in Florida, back in California. You have been everywhere. So we may lose you a little bit during this conversation, but he'll come in and out and he'll be right back in there if we do lose him. So just kind of give fair warning on that. So with that said, on your opinion, and you can be as blunt and honest about this, so don't sugarcoat it if you feel like you have to. On the 3 episodes, what was your takeaway from this, and what was your opinion of these conversations?
Sure. I mean, there's no doubt about it, right? There's no small amount of controversy around these topics. And perhaps rightfully so. There's advocacy, not just on 2 sides, but really on multiple sides. From people who, at their best have the best interest of, dogs and cats at heart. And perhaps at their worst, there might be some cynicism that creeps into the agenda. But, across that spectrum, I think where things really get interesting and sort of where the conversation is meaty is to try to tease out the facts and work with those in the best way that we can. And that's really where I find things not only to be the most interesting, but also to be the most helpful. Mm-hmm. And again, one of the things we were chatting about off air is, it's not controversial to observe that a dog or a cat can certainly survive off of the plant-based diet. But the real question is do they thrive, particularly over the long term, right? Mm-hmm. A person or an animal can definitely consume anything for a short period of time, and the effect may be a very little consequence. But the question becomes is what's the cumulative effect over time? And that's really the question at hand. And not only that, I think there's some deeper aspects to explore, right? Which are, look, we happen to be talking about two different forms of high heat processed, extruded, refortified, high glycemic bits or kibble, however, or chow, however you want to characterize them. And I think a much more interesting conversation is, well, should a dog or a cat be eating any form of that food substrate, right? And really maybe the place to start that inquiry is to look at the last several 100,000 years of evolutionary biology for canines and felines and ask, well, what did they eat? And the good news is we actually know something about that. They mainly ate what they could scavenge or what they could hunt in the wild. And so I think at prima facie observation, we can see that a kibble doesn't represent that, right? That's not a controversial observation to make. And so then the question becomes, well, should any form of kibble be considered appropriate for canine or feline? And if you use that as your point of departure, I think you get into some territory.
And see, that's the hard part here is that territory is kind of like speaking about religion. You really do hit that unfortunate nerve with different people where it's no. We can only feed kibble. No. We can only feed raw. No. We can only feed plant-based. And with that, we're not expanding our brains and we're not being able to fully evolve and learn, hey, there might be a science in this. There might be something that actually is feasible. That's what's intrigued me, and I know it's intrigued you as well.
Absolutely. And maybe another place to start or another point of departure that can be helpful is to look at the physiology of the dog or cat, right? For example, to look at their teeth, right? In comparison, say, to an herbivore, an omnivore, the molars are not flat. They are in a scissor formation for, tearing something, or ripping it apart. Additionally, you can look at, the viscera of a dog or a cat, and you can see they have non-sacculated colons, which means there's not a lot of fermenting of resistant fibers, in those species, right? There's a little bit, but not a lot. Additionally, you can look at, some of the enzymatic processes in a dog or cat. And while some of this has changed in the last 180 years ago as a result of epigenetic adaptation, dogs and cats do not express a level of amylase commensurate with an omnivore or an herbivore. Amylase being the enzyme that the ability to compromise carbohydrate or to digest it. And so, if you look at those facts, if you sort of look at canine or feline, be instructive. That can tell you something about what might be appropriate to feed them. And so, those are some of, I think, sort of the key points of analysis that can move us forward and move us into a conversation that's more helpful.
And see, you're completely right, and that was one of the big things. The criticism is, how can you call them an omnivore? And it's just the fact that they don't require to eat just meat. And it's like, when you think about it, when a dog was out in the wild, or let's just go to the whole primal, let's go way back to wolf, when they actually ate an animal, the content of a rabbit or another animal would have had a plant base in the stomach. So it's not uncommon for them to have actually evolved. And when you see some of these big pet food companies, of course, they have corn, they have wheat, they have all these little things that are in the bag and look so pretty, even though it's been rendered and it's really slaughterhouse waste now, but they make you believe that that's in the food. The hard part that I've had with all of this is it's okay for it to be on a bag of dog food and acceptable, but it's not okay to think that our dogs should have it in their food, which boggles my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. The rendering industry is actually very, very interesting. I mean, it's been around for a long time, and it's been a big part of capturing agricultural waste and repurposing it into, in many instances, food product, in some instances, fertilizer. For example, rendered meats and plants are phenomenal fertilizers for restoring nitrogen balance in fallow fields. So that, rendered products would actually be rather useful. The question becomes is that appropriate for a food product, not just for small animals like cats and dogs, but even for farm animals, like cows and chickens. And so that, that's one of the things I think that is definitely worth exploring. Additionally, there's some big things we can understand from the rendering process. For instance, high treatment, either plant.
And we're kind of having a little bit of difficulty catching up with them. Like I said, we will be coming in and out with having Daniel in and out. Unfortunately, that's just going to be part of the unfortunates of this episode. But I can hear you back there. You're back on this one. All right. So I'm sorry. I heard that you kind of disappeared, so that's why I'll jump in here whenever I hear you kind of pop in and out. So carry on with that.
Apologies for that. No. So I'll just recapitulate the last point there. That one of the things we do understand about the rendering process is that it does denature proteins. In other words, it alters the amino acid structure of proteins. Additionally, with meat-based components, it also peroxidizes the fats or burns them, which particularly for dogs, to some extent for cats as well, those peroxidized or burnt fats can contribute to pancreatic compromise in some instances. And so that there's a big difference in the metabolic effect between a raw fat and a rendered or high heat processed fat. So, and the same thing goes for plant protein structures, right? Those amino acid structures do get changed under sustained high heat. And so it's really a time under temperature question. And that's one of the things that I think, oftentimes that story per se is not necessarily disclosed as part of the marketing material for a pet food or part of the labeling text on the bag of pet food itself. The great news is these aren't hidden facts. You can use that there Google to discover them and actually learn about them. So the great news is this type of information is super accessible to both pet parents and veterinary professionals.
It's funny because you look at the situation we're in. We have pentobarbital again rearing its ugly head in pet food, which draws up so many questions. It brings up so many concerns, and then it makes me think, especially now. Okay, we don't know where the meat is coming from. We don't know what the actual meat is. Is this real, positive, good, processed meat? Is this garbage processed meat? What do we put in these dog foods? And then it comes down to the next question of where are they getting it from? How is this even possible? I mean, so then I've been thinking even more now with this whole plant-based. Well, okay, what's the pros and cons of a plant-based to avoid any kind of meat that should not have been applied to these foods?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge because what's allowed in a rendered product is pretty broad in scope. So, in fact, euthanized animals are allowed in a rendered product. Roadkill is allowed. Diseased stockyard animals are allowed. Additionally, plant waste is allowed. And so that could be like corn stalks. It could be, soybean leaves. In other words, the in other words, the non, processed component of the plant, the waste component of the plant, can qualify for rendering. So sometimes it's very difficult to, from the basis of reading an ingredient deck on a bagged food to really understand what the constituents are. Now, it's actually not hard to get those facts. And what I mean by that is anyone at their liberty, at their leisure, can send these various foods to Chromadex or Medallion or Eurofin, any number of labs. I mean, those are just examples. Any number of labs to do toxicology screening, to do macronutrient testing. What are the distribution of macronutrients? What's the percentage of high glycemic carb? What's the percentage of fiber? Things that aren't revealed on the label, or the bag of pet food. Additionally, heavy metal testing, microbial testing for E. coli, salmonella, listeria, things like that. So these are things that are, in fact, completely knowable. It does obviously take some effort and a little bit of expense on the side of a pet parent or veterinary professional to put a fine point on those answers. But these are things that are completely discoverable. And in fact, some people do this. They'll just take a sample of food, send it into a lab, have it screened, and then just know with tremendous precision, oh, okay, this is what's going on with this food.
Which, it's funny because I see it all the time, and I see different things on Facebook or even on YouTube itself, where people will open up bags and they'll break it up. And I think one of the more entertaining people is a good friend of yours, which is Rodney Habib, who really does dive into all these different things and explores them. I mean, come on, he ate dog food the other day, that dry kibble. I mean, how I can't imagine that. I was almost wondering if you were there when he did it, because I know you guys spent a lot of time together. And if you were, what was that like in person? And did you send him a message if you weren't there of what were you doing?
Well, it's funny. Sometimes I'll get little preview cuts of these things before the final, the final release version, and invariably there's quite a bit of comedy around it. I mean, the one thing that I think that Rodney does brilliantly is make a point and tell a story in a very accessible way. And his collaboration with Dr. Becker also brings a gravitas to those stories, because you're getting facts, you're getting research, you're getting a deeper insight to go along with the great storytelling. So in many respects, it's a killer combo, and those guys produce some very, very compelling content to be shared.
Now, he did one on plant-based, which I was really excited because I think we were releasing the first one of this series, and his approach, which I was a little surprised. It came a little bit shorter than I thought, but his approach was simply canola oil. And that was the real approach to it, was that it's containing a great deal of canola oil, and that's bad. I'm just trying to kind of wrap my brain around it and try to understand, how bad is it? Is it really that bad? What do we have to worry about with that one ingredient?
Indeed. I mean, really the general point about oils or fats is, what's the level of peroxidation? That's always the key question, because peroxidized fats, as we know, and there's a good 30, 40 years in the scientific literature that demonstrates what the metabolic effects are, what the systemic effects are generally speaking, not great for people, not great for dogs and cats. With some oils, there are unique properties for which they may be even less appropriate for small animals. But really the question at a high level is, what's the distribution of macronutrients in the food? And secondarily to that, to what degree have the constituents been compromised by heat? I think he was definitely zooming in on a specific component with the canola oil. But once you zoom back out, those general questions always apply. And in fact are a helpful criteria when evaluating, a consumer choice, for any given pet food, right? In other words, how can I know in advance what the glycemic impact of this food will be? How can I know in advance to what degree amino acid structures and fats have been compromised by a time under temperature process, right? And sometimes it is difficult to elucidate that as a consumer, sometimes even as a medical professional, because those things aren't typically disclosed as part of marketing or as part of any of the literature or commentary surrounding a given product.
Something that's really been, I guess, nailed into my forehead with doing this is majority of the people believe that any vegan pet parents would only be the ones to feed a plant-based diet to their dogs or cats because of their belief. And in this whole process, I haven't seen it as this is how I want to live, so I want you to live. I've come across quite a lot of vegans who are like, no, my dog or cat is on meat, raw fed, or even kibble. And I'm kind of looking at it from this perspective, but I want your perspective on it of, do you think this is a trend solely off of the fact that the person's vegan, so they want their dog or cat to be vegan, or is there something more to it?
Well, the scenario that you describe is certainly possible, right? It doesn't take a great logical leap for, a person to say, hey, I'm a vegan, therefore ipso facto, my pet should be one. But at the same time, I think you also accurately described the exception set. There's many people who elect to lead a vegan lifestyle, but don't elect that for their pet, in recognition of the fact that, it may be more biologically appropriate for that pet to eat as they would, for the last several 100,000 years, right?
Right.
And so, so people are certainly capable of making those distinctions. Not to go off on a tangent, but there are some interesting benefits to eating a vegan diet. And in fact, they happen to be the same benefit or I should say a shared benefit as eating a ketogenic diet, which is they are both restricted in methionine. And methionine is in high quantity in the body is a well-known catalyst for any number of diseases. And so, there's something interesting about that. And in the case of dogs and cats, the real question is, can a dog thrive or a cat thrive over the long haul, on solely, really it's the question is a rendered diet or a fresh diet, right? Mm-hmm. Immaterial of whether it's plant-based or not, which ultimately could become a secondary consideration. But, there are some interesting attributes to both vegan, and ketogenic diets in that respect.
What's funny is, I was going to go into everything you're part of and the whole cancer series and ketogen and all this in a moment, but you must face this. And I think we even talked about this the last time. You have to be facing this on almost a constant basis where you're hearing, my dog has cancer. And you ask the simple question, upon investigation and your whole research, you find out that the dog was on a meat-based dry kibble for all of its life. And, the science does show, and again, I've had this debate with a lot of people, but the science does show that it is in the dry kibble. And I even saw on the most recent video, which I shared on our Facebook page, which I'll go over in a little bit, but the whole cancer research or cancer series, and I love what you're doing with it. But how hard is it to battle all of these different things? And you're like, look, there's so much science out there, but everybody's still hell-bent that kibble is the only way to go.
Well, I'll tell you, in some ways, what you described makes sense in terms of, looking at the model as a battle. But more so, I think in some ways it can be helpful to recalibrate the model and say, look, rather than a battle, let's make it a party and invite people to the party. And what I mean by that is that, look, no one's going to argue that environment is a cofactor in disease. Mm-hmm. No one's going to argue that for any given disease process, there is a genetic component. Now, the evidence is showing more and more that the influence of genetics can, in many instances, be far less than the influence of epigenetics. But where I really think, the popular consciousness and to perhaps a slightly lesser degree, the consciousness of medical professionals is starting to focus on the fact that, look, the long-term choices that you make when it comes to nutrition ultimately end up having a fairly massive impact. And in some ways, that perspective is almost inescapable now when you start looking at, the long-term effects or I should say, the short-term effects in average lifespan of dogs. 30, 40 years ago, an average lifespan of a dog was, 16, 17 years old. Mm-hmm. Now it's like 9 or 10 years old. Mm-hmm. Right? Now you can look at breeding. You can look at environmental cofactors. You can look at genetics. But to obviate looking at food, looking at the long-term effects of nutrition makes less and less sense, right? And just as we see in humans that, insult from high glycemic carbohydrates sustained over a long period of time does lead to metabolic dysregulation and in turn can lead to the presentation of any number of diseases, right? The classic 5 deadly scourges. You have obesity, diabetes, cardiac disease, cognitive decline, in the form of dementia, Alzheimer's, and cancer, mm-hmm. right? There's a growing understanding that those 5 deadly scourges are really a last mile presentation, if you will, of metabolic or mitochondrial or to put a fine point on it, dysregulation to oxidative phosphorylation, right? If your mitochondria can't make their ATP, in other words, if that ATP synthase proton pump starts to get broken, that's when you have cellular dysregulation, and as a result of that, some disease begins to present, right? Perhaps it's a cognitive compromise, perhaps it's a lipid compromise in the cardiac system, perhaps it's diabetes, perhaps it's cancer. So that perspective is just slowly starting to come to the fore, but it's a very useful model, and that's why I say inviting people to that party, I think can produce some very effective results rather than trying to use that as a foil or a counter or a rebuttal to more traditionally held views, because not only is it intriguing and interesting, but it's incredibly useful because, controlling metabolism is something that anyone can do for themselves or their dog with very, very simple and sustainable changes to their meal program or their nutritional program.
Completely agree. I mean, I'll say this. It was funny, and I'll kind of go off topic a second, but after we talked the last time, it was kind of funny. We were sending text messages the next day back and forth, and you were sending me different links to different Q&As. Actually, it wasn't really Q&As. It was more or less just presentations from different veterinarians throughout the country of different models of their science. And I'll tell you this. Every one you sent me, I sat back and I watched every one. I remember it was a Saturday too, and I sat there watching every one in just amazement. It was like being a kid again, watching cartoons on Saturday morning, which sounds so ridiculous, but I was sitting there watching everyone engaged in every ounce of it, thinking, there's all this science out there. Why are we not exploring? Why are we not exploring? And I understand there are people who are doing so, and, obviously you are. But, it opened up my mind, and I maybe expanded my research and decided to open up my own views a little bit more because of what you did. And by sending me those links and me engaging them really got me going, wow, there's so much out there, and I need to be more open-minded. So I really honestly would say this whole series probably started way back then when you planted that seed in my head of all these different experiments and all these different people that were just absolutely extraordinary watching those videos and trying to digest it all. So this is probably all thanks to you.
Well, no, I mean, you make a great point. There's a lot of great people out there doing, absolutely fascinating work and really making substantive contributions to the literature, and in some instances, just substantive contributions to our anecdotal or I should say case study or case history understanding, of what can be effective, what can be valuable in small animal medicine. And the tough part is, some of that information is siloed, some of it's fractured. So there's quite a bit of sleuthing that's required to sort of assemble it all and try to put together in a coherent and comprehensive fashion. But the great news is we're in a super privileged position now because a lot of this stuff is just part of the public domain on YouTube, on Vimeo, or on any number of university websites. So you can get, video presentations, of course, a lot of the published papers, at least the abstracts are publicly accessible. So the information is most certainly there.
And see, that's what made it so interesting to me is, some of it was like, you almost could put each one together and then that fused together as one cohesive model. Because there's, of course, and you see this as well, there's things about every single research that you're going, I don't know if that's actually 100% sustainable. I don't know if that's feasible. It sounds good on paper, but I don't know if we could. And that's, again, bringing it back to plant-based. Right now, we're talking about something that is very new. It really hasn't been, especially in a kibble form, which is kind of where we're at in this whole discussion. It is new, and yet it is somewhat possible. It's just, I don't know if we're right there yet, and that's where I want your opinion, because you really are the brain behind everything. Are we there, or do we have a long way to go? Are we on the cusp of it? Where are we when it comes to plant-based?
Well, again, it's always helpful to sort of take a look towards the past, say, okay, what were dogs doing in the wild, right? Or what are dogs doing in the wild? Because there's still many more wild dogs than there are domesticated dogs. And it can be observed that, yes, they do consume plant materials, either in some instances in the prey they eat, not always, but in some instances. And, sometimes if they're scavenging, you ever seen a dog eat grass? There's some plant-based material, and some of that is high glycemic. But, in an annual period, the consensus is that a dog will get 4 to 16% of, their macronutrient distribution from carbohydrate. But the net carbohydrate is likely in the very, very low single digits when you subtract for fiber, right? And that is what's crucial to know, because even though there are periods of time where a dog may get a high bolus or a large bolus of high glycemic inputs, for example, with a fresh kill, if they're eating right there and they're getting a lot of the blood, they're getting a lot of the glycogen, right? Those effects are transitory. That's a very, very different circumstance than a dog on a daily basis eating a very high calorie, 40 to 60% high glycemic carbohydrate food. It's just, it's literally apples and oranges. It's really two different scenarios. Additionally, it shouldn't be lost that whether a dog is eating plant-based or a dog is eating meat-based or some combination of both, right? That total caloric density is a huge predictor of long-term health. I think we may have even touched on this in the prior episode together, where it's a well understood constant in the science is that, whether you're working with a dog or a cat, a bird, a flatworm, a whale, if you restrict calories by 30%, immaterial of macronutrient distribution, you just restrict calories by 30%, not only will that animal live longer, but when they are older, they will behave as a younger animal, right? In other words, their athletic capability, their blood biomarkers will all look like, appearance-wise, they will look like a younger animal. And that's a very important part that, shouldn't be lost in this whole conversation, which is, hey, look, immaterial of what you're feeding, right? And it is important to make informed choices about what you're feeding, but immaterial of that, total caloric density is a huge predictor of long-term health, right? Both for people and for cats and dogs, right? And so caloric control is a big part of ensuring that your pet at home has an opportunity to live a longer life and hopefully a life free of disease.
And see, that's just it, though. It's the science. We've got to move forward. We talk about fossil fuels, and we talk about how we need to be better to the environment. Okay, I completely agree that we're getting there with the science. The same thing's got to apply here when it comes to dog food. We've done better for our own selves. We've changed our human diets by leaps and bounds since the 90s. But we're still where we are with dog food that we were back in the 60s and 70s. Seems a little bizarre to me. That's where I'm kind of going, why aren't we changing? I mean, I'm more or less looking at this going, okay, are protein levels in plant-based the same as raw feeding? No. Are we getting all the same nutrients in a plant-based that we are in a raw feeding? Probably not. From what I'm seeing, no. Does that mean that plant-based doesn't work? And that's where I've drawn the line and said, no, that doesn't say that it doesn't work. That just means we got to work at it.
No, I mean, you make a great point there. And again, I think where things get interesting is where your point of departure is and what your criteria for analysis is, right? And anything can be functional or sustainable within a short time period, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, like, hey, if you wanted to go on a chocolate cake diet, there might be something to it for 3 or 4 days. Right. After that, it might become problematic, right? And so the real question is to look at nutrition from a long-term sustainability perspective. And when I say sustainability, I don't want to conflate that with the idea of sustainability from an agricultural process standpoint, but more so from the point of sustainability as regards mitochondrial health, mm-hmm. right? Over the lifespan of a dog or over the lifespan of a human, which forms of nutrition contribute most mightily towards mitochondrial health, right? I think we have some understanding now, in fact, a fairly profound understanding in human medicine, that insult from high glycemic carbs over a long period of time produces mitochondrial dysregulation. There's not a lot of controversy around that observation. There's a lot of good science that sort of demonstrates that fairly conclusively, right? Now, we don't have that in small animal medicine, but it's not an egregious breach of rational thinking to say, hey, look, cats and dogs have approximate physiology to humans. It's not a crazy assumption to say, hey, high glycemic load over a long period of time, immaterial of source, whether it's in combination with meat or not in combination with meat, can produce various forms of mitochondrial dysregulation or any energy production dysregulation, right? Now, granted, it's still important to go do the science and demonstrate that to a very, very high standard of rigor, right? But it's not a crazy leap of faith to assume that, that's probably the case. Additionally, I think the other part to that is as we mentioned before, the caloric control part. But the other piece that can't be left out is the energy turnover part. And what I mean by that is just as it is exercise is important for people, and when I say exercise, I mean rigorous exercise. That is very important for small animals. Mm-hmm. Why? Because you're turning over those energy sources that you're putting in. And so, dogs that have tremendously high levels of exercise, even if they're kibble fed, tend to do a lot better than animals who are kibble fed and sedentary. So that's another moving part that's absolutely crucial, a crucial cofactor, if you will, to long-term small animal health.
It's something I've been saying. I mean, I've said the same thing. It's nutrition and exercise, nutrition and exercise. They go hand in hand. We've realized it in a human standpoint. We know we have to as humans, even though I can honestly say not every human does. But we've come to that conclusion. We know we're supposed to, and I love the cake analogy because I would love to eat cake every day. Even I have to worry about that. But you can take anything in moderation. That's fine. The problem is you can't do it every day. So example A is dog is eating kibble. It's the same as human eating fast food every day. Doesn't get exercise. Human doesn't get exercise. What's going to happen but obesity? They're going to actually suffer from multiple different health conditions. If a human's going to go through it, dog who breaks down a lot quicker than human is going to break down as well. Okay, we realize this, but yet we're not engaging in it. And the science is there. In how many times have we already said the fact that it's available? Google. Very simple. All these different places we can do it. We can see all this stuff. And yet we're still stuck. We're still stuck in this mud pit, which drives me nuts. And, the next question to where we're at here is cats. How can we put cats on a plant-based diet?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, for a short period of time, it may be neither here nor there, right? The real question is does it make sense from a perspective of, sustainability and health over the long term? And it's tough to make the case for that. Just as in the same way, it's tough to make the case for that in dogs. And so I think you're still left with sort of exploring all the same arguments, right?
Right.
Does that comport with what a cat has eaten historically, over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution? And does it comport with what they eat now if they're in the wild? Probably not. It's not a controversial observation to say, not really, right? Not really. Now, for a short period of time, could it make sense? Particularly given any number of circumstances. Some of them might be, circumstances of economic challenge. Some of them might be access to resources. Some of them might be, just what's available in any given location, right? There could be a logistical component to it. So I think when it comes to something like that, you can make an argument for just about anything. It just sort of almost goes back to the chocolate cake argument, right? You can be on a chocolate cake diet for a couple days. It's probably not gonna really do much. If you try to increase that to a couple of weeks, you could run into some serious problems. So I think the question really becomes in all of this, how do we administrate on behalf of these animals, whether from the perspective of a pet parent or from the perspective of a medical professional, how do we administrate an appropriate nutritional program on their behalf? Because in a situation where the animal is domesticated, they really have no say.
Right.
So what we do really, really matters.
Right. And, one of the funny parts about this whole conversation is we've had this conversation before recording all of these different episodes and all the other things. I was never the person that was I'm advocating that we need to completely eliminate meat from our dogs and cats. Never was that ever the actual objective here. The objective has always been, how do we incorporate it? How do we improve the science? And how do we actually make this sustainable? Or is it possible to make it sustainable? In doing this whole thing, you're advocating to eliminate meat from cats and dogs' diets. No, I'm actually advocating let's have a conversation and figure out how to improve nutrition. Not how do we eliminate any kind of meats. It's how do we actually make this work? How do we look at the science? Is the earth flat? Is the earth round? Kind of argument in a sense. So it's just kind of funny how this whole thing has come about. And, you see so much science and different things being done daily. And I'm sure you've seen the pros and the cons behind this. Yes, we're still behind. we realize that. We're still not there. But let's just say, for example, we put plant-based in our dog's food. Good thing, bad thing. Your take?
Well, again, I think that goes back to what's the duration of time that that's going to happen, right? If you're going to do it for a month, it probably, there's no measurable impact. If you're going to do that for a year, okay, the question becomes, does that make sense, right? I mean, one of the biggest challenges with plant-based proteins is in comparison to meat-based proteins or dairy-based or dairy derivative proteins, leucine content is much lower. Now, in some instances, those plants are, leucine being an amino acid crucial for muscle protein synthesis, right? Now, in some instances, those plant-based proteins are fortified with more leucine to make up for that deficit, but not in all cases. So those are some of the key comparative metrics that you want to look at when making those choices, right? And particularly if you've got a young dog, a puppy who's growing, right? High leucine content is critical for muscle protein synthesis and growth for that dog. So if you're using a substrate that has a lower amount, you can observe a fairly significant impact over, like I said, over a longer time horizon, right? In a short time horizon, a lot of things can make sense. But over a long time horizon, you really have to become more judicious about what those choices look like.
And see, I tell people all the time, you need to put some kind of broccoli or some kind of plant-based in your dog's food. But that doesn't mean eliminate the actual meat. I still feed all the raw meat that I do, but I do add a cupful of a fresh vegetable. This actually is sustainable. This helps my dog. And, I have an older dog who, being an Akita, you know how she can break down. She's 9 and acts like she's probably 2. Now that's pretty darn good considering. And yet I'm saying this as 9 years old is, hey, look, we did it. We made it to this plateau, which honestly, a dog like this should be able to make it to 15 to near 20 in reality. But if we put it on our regular meat-based kibble, it's not going to. If we put it on a plant-based and only plant-based, I really honestly don't think that it is possible for a dog to actually run like this. And again, if you want an analogy, can we put unleaded in a high performance vehicle? You could. It's not going to work well. Same thing applies. And that's the only way I've been able to come to the science and the conclusions. And that's where being able to talk to you about this and kick this around with you, you really understand it to a full degree. I'm scratching the surface. And that's where I love being able to talk to you because you can really see it where I probably can't.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, I think like we covered it at the beginning, these topics are just invariably fascinating and intriguing for me. So I really never get bored. And additionally, I'm always trying to learn more because frankly, there is a lot more to learn. The good news is, we do have quite a bit in the veterinary literature to draw from both currently and historically. And I think as more people in the veterinary research sciences gain an interest in these topics, we'll start to see more of the conversation that we're having now being reflected in the literature. I'm excited to see what answers are gonna appear there, because some of them can be rather counterintuitive, and what we know now may have to evolve and change, as we learn more.
And I agree with that. See, I don't think it's completely dead science that we shouldn't be exploring. I think it is something we should, but from my perspective, I realize that there's work to be done. I'm curious what you think needs to be done to actually make this sustainable, so it's not just something that can be a short term, but an actual long term or even a permanent fixture? Is there anything that we've been able to learn from plant-based that actually can make it sustainable, or we don't have the science yet?
Well, I'll tell you, I think the most interesting aspect of just plants as part of the spectrum of nutrition for small animals is kind of what you touched on before. And you said, hey, sometimes I like to add a broccoli to my dog's meat. Well, that's a fairly representative analog to the amount of fiber that a dog or a cat might encounter in the wild, right? And really there's two key differences in what you're talking about. One, that piece of broccoli has not been exposed to high heat.
Right.
Two, as a carbohydrate source, it's extremely high in fiber. So the net glycemic load is tremendously low. Again, two cofactors that more or less are very representative of what a dog or a cat might encounter in the wild. So do plants have a role to play in canine and feline nutrition? Sure. Right? I think it's sort of self-evident that they do. The question is how are they delivered? How are they administered, and in what forms?
Right.
Once you're having that conversation, man, now you're really getting to the meat and potatoes of the whole thing. And that's where it gets exciting because, as we touched on before, ultimately we're making these decisions on behalf of the animal. They don't really have a voice in those choices. So the choices really count.
Did any one of the episodes stand out to you? And I mean, again, I'm really more or less willing to have the conversation where everybody can hear it. But did anything stand out? Did anybody speak and say anything that really sparked something in your brain, or was it all pretty much just relative what you've already heard so far?
Well, I'll tell you, I think, I was privileged enough to sort of get the sneak preview that you gave me. And really what I reflected on was the cumulative effect of the conversation, right? Because to me, what's so powerful about all this is that you're bringing people to the table and you're saying, hey, look, let's not only talk about these topics, but let's give ourselves permission to tread in territory that's controversial, to perhaps tread in territory that is sensitive. You made the comment about sort of it's tough when you may be putting pressure on or stepping on people's religion or just very, very closely guarded agendas, right? Mm-hmm. But giving yourself permission to do that and having that conversation publicly, is generally a very healthy thing. Because you're offering people perspective, and you're offering people an opportunity to reflect on ultimately the choices that they're going to make. And I think that's powerful.
And this was a subject that it really, honestly, everybody has an opinion that it's not feasible. It can't be done. Why support it? You're pretty much a witch. I felt like that throughout this whole process. You're a witch. It felt like the Salem Witch Project all over again. I felt like I was standing there going, no, we really could look at the science. No, you're a witch. It was kind of almost asinine throughout this process. And, we've already released 3 of the episodes and, this is it. And I'll be honest, I feel and this is just from my perspective, I actually feel bad for anybody who is involved in the science. I have a lot of sympathy for them because if I've taken the amount of abuse for doing this, for even wanting to have this conversation, what are these poor people taking on a daily basis? You're an idiot. You can't do that. I mean, I talked to VDog a couple times since, and I really expressed my sympathy to them. You guys don't deserve that. That's, they're at least trying to make a difference. And that's the big thing. Is it where we need to be? No. But is anything where it needs to be? No. We always can improve. I mean, look at what you're doing. I mean, the science continuously changes, right? So that's
I mean, that's a great way of thinking about it, right? If you look at this as a learning process, as a process of discovery, a process of rational inquiry, you're giving yourself permission in advance to evolve your perspective where warranted, right? As new facts come to the fore, and perhaps those facts are weighty and substantive. You say, okay, well, I'll take that on and I'll evolve my perspective a little bit. This is, I think, probably the most powerful attribute of what, science offers us is the ability to alter and change and evolve our perspective based on new information that's compelling, that's well validated, and for which, ultimately a growing consensus is established. So, I think if as a working group, a larger working group, or ultimately people who all share, for the most part, I think the same interest, which is the care and the condition and the health of their pets at home, we can really make some forward progress.
I think it's there. I mean, you're involved in ketogenics, which I'm sure in a very, distant past, and not even probably that much of a past, people said it's impossible and said the exact same thing. And the science continues to grow. And it's like, that's what you do. And the whole aspect is way beyond my brain spectrum. My brain literally shuts off whenever I really try to dive into it. That's why I've always said you are so brilliant. And even our last conversation, I was trying to keep up. And I realized your knowledge is way surpassed past me. I mean, you're in another universe where I'm maybe hovering a couple feet off the ground in Earth. And yet together, when we're going over different things, it's just this science of, hey, this is possible. And that's what makes it so unique to have conversations with you. And that's why I love being able to talk to you.
Indeed, likewise. And like I mentioned before, just exploring these topics is invariably a blast, man. So, I'm having fun right there along with you.
Well, is there anything that we didn't cover? Is there anything you wanted to add to this that, I honestly, like I said, you're in another universe in knowledge than I am. Is there anything we did not cover that really should be in there?
Well, I tell you, man, I think we did some damage today. I think we covered a lot of territory, and I would leave it like this. Let's find an excuse to get back together and keep the conversation going.
Anytime, man. You know that. I mean, come on. We talk constantly, it seems like, so I'm always happy to be able to talk to you. But yeah, we'll definitely, sit down and have another conversation about another topic down the road, and not too far distant road, that is. Well, I'm Chris Green. This has been the Plant-Based Diet Series, and this is the conclusion episode. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.